Federal investigators may have uncovered a new piece of evidence that could reshape the investigation into the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. For months, the case has centered on a single account of what happened on the night she vanished in the Bahamas. According to her husband, Brian Hooker, the couple was returning to their sailboat when a tragic accident unfolded in the darkness. He reported that Lynette fell into the water, that he was unable to restart their dinghy, and that he spent hours stranded before eventually reaching shore and seeking help. But as investigators continued examining evidence from multiple sources, new questions began to emerge. Questions about timing, questions about location, questions about whether every part of the reported sequence of events can be independently verified. And now, according to multiple reports, investigators have focused attention on electronic records that may provide an entirely separate timeline from the one originally described. If those records ultimately prove significant, they could become one of the most important developments in a case that has already attracted international attention. Before we continue, it is important to remember that this remains an active and unresolved investigation. Lynette Hooker has not been found, and no court has established exactly what happened to her. Many details discussed publicly come from investigative reports, witness accounts, and evidence that continues to be evaluated. As always, our goal is to examine the known facts and the documented developments surrounding this case. And if you appreciate detailed, fact-focused true crime investigations, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Brian Crime TV. Your support helps us continue bringing you carefully researched coverage of complex and developing cases. To understand why investigators became so interested in digital evidence, we first need to understand the people at the center of this mystery. Long before federal investigators began examining electronic records, Lynette and Brian Hooker appeared to be living a life that many people only dream about. The couple spent years traveling aboard their sailboat, documenting their experiences online and sharing photographs of life at sea. Their vessel, known as Soulmate, became both their home and their means of exploring destinations throughout the Caribbean and beyond. To friends, family members, and followers, the images painted a picture of freedom and adventure. The couple appeared to have embraced a lifestyle centered around travel, sailing, and life on the water. Their social media presence showed tropical destinations, quiet anchorages, and the unique experiences that come with living aboard a cruising yacht. At the center of many of those posts was Lynette Hooker. Those who knew her described her as active, energetic, and deeply engaged in the lifestyle she had built. She appeared physically fit and comfortable with the demands of living aboard a sailboat. Friends often described her as independent and adventurous. Whether exercising on deck, exploring coastal communities, or sharing moments from daily life, she appeared fully invested in the journey she and Brian had chosen. For people close to her, that image would become important after her disappearance. Family members and friends struggled to understand how someone so experienced and familiar with life on the water could simply vanish without answers. Brian Hooker brought a different background to life aboard Soulmate. Public reports describe him as a retired Marine and an experienced sailor who handled much of the vessel's technical operation. Friends and acquaintances reportedly viewed him as someone who enjoyed navigation systems, onboard technology, and maintaining the complex equipment necessary for long-distance cruising. Together, the couple spent years creating what appeared to be a successful sailing life. Their online presence attracted viewers interested in travel and boating, and their adventures often reflected the aspirations of many retirees seeking a different path. From the outside, there appeared to be little indication that their story would eventually become the focus of an international investigation. But in April of 2026, everything changed. On April 4th, Lynette and Brian Hooker were in the Bahamas near Hopetown and Elbow Cay. According to reports, the couple spent part of the day onshore before returning toward their vessel later that evening. Witnesses later recalled seeing them together. By most accounts, nothing appeared obviously unusual during those interactions. The evening seemed routine. The couple spent time in the area and eventually prepared to return to Soulmate, which was anchored offshore. According to Brian Hooker's account, they left around sunset and boarded a small dinghy that would take them back to their sailboat. What happened next would become the central mystery of the entire case. Brian later told authorities that difficult conditions developed while they were crossing the water. According to his account, Lynette fell overboard while holding the ignition key for the dinghy. He reported that the engine stopped, leaving him unable to restart the vessel. He further stated that he attempted to save her but lost sight of her in the darkness. According to his account, he remained stranded for hours before eventually making his way back toward shore. Once authorities were notified, an extensive search effort began. The response quickly expanded. Bahamian authorities launched search operations. Marine units entered the area. Aircraft participated in aerial searches. Additional resources were brought in as investigators and rescue personnel worked to locate Lynette. The search covered significant sections of surrounding waters. Hour after hour passed, then day after day. Yet no confirmed trace of Lynette was found. No rescue, no verified sighting, no clear explanation. In those early stages, many observers viewed the incident as a tragic maritime accident. The story sounded heartbreaking. A husband and wife returning to their boat. A sudden emergency. A desperate effort to survive. A woman disappearing into the darkness. Public sympathy naturally followed. Many people saw Brian as someone who had survived an unimaginable ordeal while losing his wife in the process. And for a time, investigators appeared focused on determining whether the disappearance was exactly what it initially seemed to be. A tragic accident at sea. But as investigators continued reviewing evidence, they began doing what investigators always do. They tested the timeline. Every major investigation depends on timelines. Investigators compare statements against records, records against witness observations, and witness observations against physical evidence. The goal is not to confirm a theory. The goal is to determine whether the facts align. In this case, reports indicate that investigators began identifying questions they believed warranted closer examination. One of the earliest areas of interest involved weather conditions. According to public reporting, investigators reviewed meteorological information from the region covering the period when Lynette disappeared. They wanted to understand exactly what conditions existed in the area and whether those conditions matched the circumstances described. Weather matters in maritime investigations. Wind, currents, visibility, rainfall, and sea state can all influence how an incident unfolds. They can affect survival, search operations, and the reliability of witness observations. Investigators reportedly examined available weather records as part of their effort to reconstruct events. That review became one component of a broader timeline analysis. Another component involved witness accounts. As authorities worked to understand the sequence of events, they spoke with individuals who had been in the vicinity during the relevant time period. Witness statements are rarely perfect, and investigators understand that memories can be incomplete or mistaken. Nevertheless, they remain an important part of reconstructing events. Some accounts reportedly drew attention because investigators believed they might help establish timing. Whenever multiple independent sources of information point toward the same time frame, investigators take notice. That does not mean any single observation proves anything. Rather, it becomes one piece of a much larger puzzle. As the investigation expanded, authorities increasingly focused on the question that would eventually come to dominate the case. Was the timeline accurate? That question may sound simple, but in reality, it sits at the heart of nearly every major investigation. If a timeline is correct, evidence should generally align with it. If evidence repeatedly conflicts with a timeline, investigators must determine why. Sometimes those conflicts have innocent explanations. Sometimes witnesses are mistaken. Sometimes records are incomplete. And sometimes investigators discover information they did not expect to find. By this stage of the investigation, authorities were no longer relying solely on interviews and witness recollections. They began turning their attention toward technology. Modern vessels generate enormous amounts of information. Navigation equipment, communication systems, onboard networks, internet connections, and electronic devices all have the potential to create records. Most people never think about those records. Investigators do, because technology often documents activity without realizing that activity may someday become evidence. Every connection, every timestamp, every activation, every system event, each can contribute to a larger picture. As federal investigators continued examining Soulmate, they reportedly began treating the vessel not simply as a sailboat, but as a source of potentially valuable digital evidence. And the deeper they looked, the more interested they became in what those systems might reveal. What they would eventually discover could lead investigators toward one of the most closely examined categories of evidence in the entire case. Evidence that, according to reports, may have preserved activity occurring aboard the yacht during critical hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance. And if those records prove reliable, they may offer investigators something they have been seeking since the beginning: an independent timeline. As investigators continued examining the disappearance of Lynette Hooker, their attention increasingly shifted toward a category of evidence that rarely plays a central role in missing person cases: technology. In many investigations, detectives rely heavily on witness statements, physical evidence, and interviews. Those elements remain critical. But modern life leaves behind something previous generations never had to consider: digital footprints. Phones create records. Computers create records. Navigation systems create records. Internet connections create records. And in some cases, even the systems designed to power a vessel can create records. The deeper investigators looked into the circumstances surrounding Lynette's disappearance, the more interested they reportedly became in the electronic systems aboard Soulmate. Like many modern cruising sailboats, the vessel was equipped with an array of technology designed to make life at sea safer and more comfortable. Navigation equipment monitored the boat's location. Communication systems allowed contact with the outside world. Internet connectivity provided access even when the vessel was far from traditional infrastructure. For the average sailor, those systems are conveniences. For investigators, they can become silent witnesses. Unlike human memory, electronic records do not forget details because time has passed. They are not influenced by emotion. They do not become confused during interviews. Instead, they record activity as it happens. That does not mean every record is automatically accurate or easy to interpret. Investigators must still determine what the data means and whether alternative explanations exist. But when multiple digital systems begin creating a timeline, authorities pay close attention. Reports indicate that investigators examined various categories of electronic information associated with the vessel. Among those categories were network records and internet-related activity. At first glance, internet records may not sound particularly important in a disappearance investigation. Yet, modern networks can reveal valuable information. Devices often create timestamps when they connect. Systems may record activity. Connections can help establish whether equipment was active during a specific period. Investigators reportedly reviewed available electronic records in an effort to understand what activity may have occurred aboard Soulmate during the hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance. Their objective was straightforward. They wanted to compare digital information against the timeline that had already been provided. As investigators worked through those records, they continued asking the same question that had guided much of the investigation. What happened during the critical hours after Lynette was last seen? The answer remained unclear. Yet, according to public reporting, digital evidence increasingly became an important focus. Investigators were no longer examining isolated facts. They were attempting to reconstruct an entire sequence of events. That process required them to compare information from multiple sources: witness accounts, weather information, search records, electronic data, and eventually another category of evidence that attracted significant attention: the yacht's electrical system. To understand why that system became important, investigators reportedly looked back several months before Lynette disappeared. According to reports, Soulmate had previously experienced a lightning strike. For anyone familiar with life at sea, lightning represents one of the most serious hazards a vessel can encounter. A direct strike has the potential to damage electronics, disable equipment, and compromise systems throughout a boat. Following the incident, repairs and upgrades reportedly became necessary. Public reports indicate that portions of the vessel's electrical infrastructure were updated, including the installation of newer battery-related technology. At the time, nobody could have anticipated that those upgrades might later become relevant to a missing person investigation. To most people, a battery performs a simple function. It stores energy. But modern marine battery systems can be far more sophisticated. Many are capable of monitoring electrical activity throughout a vessel. They track usage, system performance, charging cycles, and power consumption. Their primary purpose is practical. Sailors use the information to manage onboard systems and maintain battery health. However, the same information can sometimes provide insight into activity occurring aboard a vessel. That possibility reportedly attracted investigators' attention. As authorities examined evidence from Soulmate, they sought to determine whether electrical records could help answer an important question. What activity, if any, occurred aboard the yacht during the hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance? The significance of that question becomes clearer when viewed alongside the broader investigation. By this point, authorities had already spent months reviewing evidence. They had examined timelines. They had interviewed witnesses. They had evaluated weather information. They had analyzed electronic records. Now they were exploring whether another source of information could help establish a more complete picture. According to public reporting, investigators reviewed data associated with the vessel's electrical systems as part of that effort. Reports discussing those records have generated significant public interest. Some accounts have suggested that investigators identified activity they considered important. Others have emphasized that digital evidence often requires careful interpretation before conclusions can be drawn. That distinction matters. Electronic records can reveal activity. They do not automatically explain why that activity occurred. A system activation does not necessarily identify who caused it. A power event does not automatically establish intent. Investigators must evaluate context, compare records, and consider alternative explanations before determining significance. Nevertheless, authorities reportedly viewed the information as important enough to examine closely. As a result, the discussion surrounding battery-related evidence became one of the most talked-about aspects of the investigation. What makes this development particularly notable is that it reflects a broader trend in modern criminal investigations. Technology increasingly plays a central role in determining timelines. In earlier decades, investigators might have relied almost entirely on witness recollections. Today, they often have access to records generated automatically by devices and systems. The challenge is not simply collecting information. The challenge is understanding what that information means. Throughout the investigation, authorities have repeatedly emphasized the importance of corroboration. One piece of evidence rarely tells the entire story. A witness statement may raise a question. A digital record may raise another. A physical item may create additional uncertainty. Individually, each piece may reveal only a small part of the picture. Together, they can help investigators determine whether events unfolded as originally believed. That process appears to be exactly what investigators have been doing in the Hooker case. They have compared different sources of information. They have examined competing timelines. They have searched for areas where evidence aligns and areas where questions remain. And despite months of work, many of those questions still have not been answered. That reality highlights one of the most important facts in this entire case. Lynette Hooker remains missing. For all the discussion surrounding digital evidence, technology, timelines, and investigative developments, the central mystery has not changed. A woman disappeared. Her family still lacks definitive answers, and investigators continue working to determine exactly what happened. Cases like this often unfold slowly. Public attention tends to focus on dramatic developments and major revelations. Yet, real investigations rarely proceed in a straight line. Evidence must be collected. Records must be verified. Experts must evaluate information. Investigators must distinguish between possibility and proof. That process can take months, sometimes years. And even then, definitive answers are not always immediately available. In the case of Lynette Hooker, authorities continue examining evidence while attempting to reconstruct events that occurred on a dark night in the Bahamas. Every new lead is measured against existing information. Every record is compared against the broader timeline. Every potential clue is evaluated for reliability. Because ultimately, investigators face a standard far higher than public speculation. They must determine what can be proven, not what might have happened. Not what people suspect. What the evidence establishes. That distinction remains critically important. Public interest in this case has grown because of the unanswered questions. Questions about timing. Questions about location. Questions about electronic records. Questions about activity aboard Soulmate. Yet questions alone are not conclusions. Investigators must continue gathering facts and testing theories against evidence. As of now, the disappearance of Lynette Hooker remains unresolved. Authorities continue evaluating information from multiple sources while seeking a clearer understanding of what occurred. And perhaps that is what makes this case so compelling. The deeper investigators look, the more they appear to encounter competing possibilities. One possibility suggests a tragic accident at sea. Another possibility suggests that additional questions still need answers. Determining which explanation best fits the evidence remains the responsibility of investigators. For now, the mystery continues. A woman vanished in the waters of the Bahamas. A family continues searching for answers. Investigators continue examining records, timelines, and evidence. And somewhere within those records may be information that helps explain what happened on the night Lynette Hooker disappeared. Whether that information ultimately resolves the case remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, the search for answers is far from over. If you found this investigation informative and want continued coverage of developing true crime cases, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Brian Crime TV. We will continue following major developments and bringing you carefully researched updates as new information becomes available. Until definitive answers emerge, one question remains at the center of everything. What happened to Lynette Hooker? Federal investigators reportedly believe the answer to the Lynette Hooker mystery may have been sitting silently aboard the yacht the entire time. Not inside a witness statement, not hidden in a confession, not buried beneath the waters of the Bahamas, but inside the electrical systems of a sailboat called Soulmate. For months, investigators examining Lynette Hooker's disappearance have worked to answer one central question. What really happened during the critical hours after she vanished near Elbow Cay in April of 2026? According to public reports, that question has led authorities through witness accounts, weather data, internet records, GPS information, and now one of the most unusual categories of evidence in the entire investigation, battery logs. And according to reports surrounding the case, those records may have documented activity aboard the yacht during the same period Brian Hooker claimed he was stranded elsewhere. Before we continue, it is important to remember that this remains an active and unresolved investigation. Lynette Hooker has not been found, and no court has established exactly what happened that night. Many of the details discussed publicly involve investigative theories, allegations, or evidence still being evaluated by authorities. Our goal is to examine the documented developments and the questions investigators reportedly continue trying to answer. And if you appreciate detailed true crime investigations focused on evidence and timelines, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Brian Crime TV for continued coverage of developing cases. To understand why federal investigators reportedly became so focused on battery records, we first need to go back several months before Lynette disappeared. According to reports, Soulmate had previously suffered a lightning strike. For sailors, lightning is one of the most dangerous threats at sea. A direct strike can damage electronics, disable navigation systems, destroy communications equipment, and compromise electrical infrastructure throughout an entire vessel. Public reports indicate the damage aboard Soulmate was serious enough that major repairs became necessary. Portions of the yacht's electrical systems were reportedly replaced. Equipment was upgraded. New technology was installed. Among those upgrades were advanced lithium battery systems capable of monitoring electrical activity aboard the vessel. At the time, nobody could have imagined those upgrades might later become relevant in a missing person investigation. To most people, a battery is simply something that stores power. But modern marine battery systems can be significantly more sophisticated than many realize. Some are capable of tracking power consumption across various onboard systems. They can record activations, monitor usage patterns, and document electrical loads generated throughout a vessel. Their primary purpose is practical. Sailors rely on those systems to manage energy consumption while living aboard for extended periods. But for investigators, those same records can potentially serve another function entirely. They can help reconstruct activity. That possibility reportedly drew significant attention from federal investigators once authorities gained access to Soulmate and began examining the vessel's systems more closely. According to public reporting, investigators wanted to answer a very specific question. What activity occurred aboard the yacht during the hours Lynette disappeared? That question mattered because, according to Lynette Hooker's account, the answer should have been relatively straightforward. Very little. Brian stated that after Lynette entered the water, he was stranded away from the vessel in a disabled dinghy. According to his timeline, Soulmate should have remained anchored offshore while he struggled to survive and eventually make his way back toward land. But according to reports discussing the investigation, battery-related records allegedly suggested electrical activity may have occurred aboard the vessel during portions of that same period. At first glance, that might not sound unusual. Boats consume electricity constantly. Refrigeration systems cycle on and off. Monitoring equipment remains active. Various automatic systems operate throughout the day and night. Electrical fluctuations alone do not necessarily indicate anything suspicious. Investigators understood that. The issue reportedly was not merely the existence of electrical activity. It was the timing and the pattern. According to reports, investigators identified electrical events they believed warranted closer examination. Some reports described power spikes or activations that investigators allegedly considered potentially significant when compared against the broader timeline. That immediately raised additional questions. If certain onboard systems were active during periods when the vessel was expected to be largely inactive, investigators needed to determine why. One category of activity reportedly attracted particular attention: the freshwater system. Like many live-aboard cruising vessels, Soulmate reportedly used electrically powered pumps to distribute fresh water throughout the yacht. When faucets are used, pumps activate. When sinks operate, pumps activate. When showers run, pumps activate. Each action generates electrical demand. According to reports discussing the investigation, investigators allegedly identified activity that they believed could be consistent with freshwater system usage during relevant portions of the timeline. If accurate, that interpretation could suggest somebody may have been using systems aboard the vessel during hours that investigators were carefully examining. Importantly, investigators would still need to determine exactly what caused those events and whether alternative explanations existed. Electrical records alone do not automatically identify who activated a system or why it was activated. But the reports surrounding those findings reportedly increased investigators' interest in the vessel's digital records. Additional reports suggested investigators examined other categories of electrical activity as well: interior lighting, general electrical loads, appliance-related power consumption. Again, none of those activities would necessarily be unusual aboard an occupied yacht. The significance depended entirely on timing. Investigators reportedly spent extensive time comparing those electronic records against other categories of evidence already being examined in the case: weather information, witness accounts, movement timelines, internet-related records, search activity, and statements provided during the investigation. The objective was not simply to determine whether electrical activity occurred. The objective was to determine whether multiple independent sources of information supported the same sequence of events. Because by this stage of the investigation, authorities were no longer examining isolated clues. They were examining patterns. That distinction is important. Major investigations are rarely solved through one dramatic revelation. Instead, investigators often build timelines by comparing many smaller details. A witness account may raise one question. A weather record may raise another. Digital records may add additional information. Eventually, investigators determine whether those pieces align or conflict. According to reports surrounding the Hooker investigation, authorities increasingly focused on whether the digital evidence aligned with the timeline originally provided. And as more information reportedly emerged, the timeline itself became one of the central issues in the case. That is one reason investigators reportedly became so interested in technology. Technology creates records automatically. Phones create timestamps. Internet systems generate logs. Navigation equipment stores information. Battery systems can document electrical activity. Unlike human memory, those systems are not influenced by stress, emotion, or hindsight. That does not make them infallible. Digital evidence still requires interpretation and verification. But investigators often view independent electronic records as valuable because they can help establish objective sequences of activity. Reports indicate investigators also examined internet-related records associated with Soulmate. Like many modern long-range cruising vessels, the yacht reportedly utilized satellite internet technology that allowed devices aboard to remain connected even while anchored offshore. Investigators reportedly reviewed network-related information as part of their broader effort to reconstruct activity during the hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance. Again, the importance of those records depended on timing. If electronic systems appeared active during periods investigators believed required closer scrutiny, authorities naturally wanted to understand why. As the investigation expanded, authorities reportedly examined additional areas connected to digital tracking and location information. According to public reporting, investigators became aware of prior allegations connected to Brian Hooker's former employment involving GPS tracking and location monitoring technology. Importantly, those allegations were not directly connected to Lynette's disappearance, and prior allegations alone do not establish wrongdoing in an unrelated investigation. The transcript itself repeatedly emphasizes that point. However, reports indicate investigators nevertheless considered the information potentially relevant because the central issue in the case increasingly revolved around location and timeline reconstruction. Where was Brian during the critical hours? That question sat at the center of nearly every category of evidence investigators reportedly examined. Witness observations reportedly raised timeline questions. Weather records reportedly raised timeline questions. Electronic activity reportedly raised timeline questions. Battery-related data reportedly raised timeline questions. Everything appeared to lead investigators back to the same issue: the timeline. As public interest intensified, scrutiny surrounding Brian Hooker's actions also increased. In the immediate aftermath of Lynette's disappearance, many observers viewed Brian sympathetically. Publicly, the case initially appeared to involve a tragic accident at sea, a husband surviving a traumatic ordeal after losing his wife in darkness and rough conditions. But as investigators reportedly uncovered additional information, discussion surrounding the case grew more intense. Reports indicate Brian eventually returned to the United States while the investigation remained active in the Bahamas. That decision generated significant public debate. Some observers questioned the move. Others defended it. Investigators, however, reportedly continued focusing primarily on verifiable evidence rather than public reaction. That distinction matters because behavior alone rarely solves cases. Evidence does. Investigators understand that grief affects different people in different ways. Some individuals remain highly visible after traumatic events. Others withdraw. Some cooperate publicly. Others avoid media attention entirely. For investigators, the critical issue remained whether evidence from multiple independent sources aligned with the known timeline. And according to reports surrounding the case, authorities increasingly focused on whether those independent records pointed toward the same conclusions. By this stage of the investigation, authorities reportedly had spent months comparing information from numerous sources. Witness accounts, weather data, digital timestamps, battery system records, internet activity, movement information, search records. Investigators allegedly compared those categories repeatedly in an effort to determine whether they supported one coherent sequence of events. That process reflects how many circumstantial investigations are constructed. Contrary to popular belief, most cases are not solved by one dramatic clue that instantly reveals everything. Instead, investigators assemble many smaller details and evaluate whether those details reinforce each other. One piece may reveal almost nothing on its own. 10 pieces reveal more. 50 pieces begin creating a larger picture. According to reports, investigators in the Hooker case increasingly believed multiple categories of evidence were generating similar questions. Questions about timing, questions about movement, questions about activity aboard Soulmate, questions about whether events unfolded exactly as originally described. As authorities continued analyzing digital records, investigators also reportedly examined physical evidence aboard the vessel itself. This involved a more traditional investigative process. Inventory, storage areas, equipment, objects visible in historical photographs and videos. Investigators reportedly reviewed items known to have previously been aboard the yacht in an effort to determine whether anything appeared unusual or difficult to account for. One area reportedly receiving attention involved Lynette's fitness equipment. Friends, family members, and social media posts consistently described Lynette as physically active and focused on health and fitness. Photographs reportedly showed her exercising aboard the yacht and maintaining workout routines even while traveling. According to reports, investigators reviewed workout-related equipment previously visible aboard Soulmate, including free weights and dumbbells. Authorities reportedly compared historical images, videos, and inventories while attempting to determine whether all known equipment could be accounted for. Importantly, the transcript itself repeatedly emphasizes that missing or relocated items do not automatically indicate criminal activity. Equipment can be moved, misplaced, discarded, or incorrectly identified for entirely innocent reasons. Investigators reportedly understood all of those possibilities. Nevertheless, because the investigation already involved questions surrounding timelines and onboard activity, any item appearing difficult to explain naturally drew attention. Reports also indicate investigators examined scuba equipment maintained aboard Soulmate. For sailors cruising the Bahamas, diving equipment is extremely common. The region is famous for reefs, marine life, and clear water. Many long-term sailors carry tanks, regulators, fins, and related equipment as part of ordinary life aboard. According to reports, investigators reviewed the condition and apparent usage patterns of certain diving-related equipment while attempting to reconstruct activity surrounding Lynette's disappearance. Once again, the issue reportedly was not necessarily what investigators found, but the questions those findings created. If certain equipment appeared recently used, investigators naturally wanted to determine when it had been used, who used it, and whether those patterns aligned with the broader timeline under review. At this point in the investigation, authorities reportedly were no longer looking at isolated clues. They were evaluating whether multiple categories of evidence overlapped. That distinction is critically important. One of the biggest mistakes people make while following high-profile investigations is assuming every suspicious detail carries equal evidentiary weight. Investigators do not approach cases that way. A theory is not evidence, a possibility is not proof, and a question is not the same thing as a conclusion. Throughout the investigation into Lynette Hooker's disappearance, authorities reportedly explored numerous possible explanations while attempting to determine what happened aboard Soulmate. Some explanations involve accidental scenarios. Others involve more troubling possibilities. At this stage, many publicly discussed details remain allegations, investigative theories, or areas of ongoing analysis rather than established facts proven in court. That is why investigators focus so heavily on corroboration. One clue by itself rarely resolves an investigation. But when multiple independent sources of information appear to point towards similar questions, investigators pay attention. And according to reports, that is precisely what appears to have happened in this case. Authorities reportedly found themselves confronting a growing collection of unresolved questions. Questions about witness observations, questions about weather conditions, questions about internet activity, questions about digital records, questions about battery system data, questions about equipment aboard the yacht. Individually, each detail may have an explanation. Together, investigators reportedly believed the questions became more difficult to ignore. Yet, despite months of analysis, enormous public attention, and continued investigative efforts, one central fact has never changed. Lynette Hooker remains missing. And without definitive answers regarding what happened to her, every new development has only deepened the mystery. As the investigation continued, many observers reportedly began viewing the case differently than they had in the beginning. Initially, the explanation seemed tragically straightforward. A husband and wife returning to their sailboat, an accident on the water, a disappearance in darkness. But according to reports surrounding the investigation, the more authorities examined digital evidence and reconstructed timelines, the more complicated the picture appeared to become. Investigators reportedly reviewed weather information and found questions they believed required additional examination. Witness accounts reportedly created timing concerns. Electronic records reportedly generated additional scrutiny. And then came the battery system records, perhaps the most unusual evidence category in the entire investigation. According to reports, those records allegedly preserved information investigators believed could help establish an independent timeline of activity aboard Soulmate. Not based on memory, not based on speculation, but based on automatically generated records documenting electrical events aboard the vessel. That possibility is what makes the battery evidence so significant to investigators. Technology does not tell stories. It simply records activity. Authorities reportedly continued comparing those records against statements, timelines, witness observations, and other evidence while attempting to determine whether all available information could be reconciled into one coherent explanation. To this day, the disappearance of Lynette Hooker remains unresolved. Investigators reportedly continue evaluating evidence while attempting to determine what happened aboard Soulmate on the night Lynette vanished in the Bahamas. The case has generated widespread attention not only among true crime audiences, but also among maritime experts interested in the unusual role digital vessel systems may play in modern investigations. Yet, despite all the theories, speculation, and public discussion, investigators ultimately face a much higher standard than public opinion. Questions alone are not enough. Suspicion alone is not enough. Authorities must determine what can actually be proven. That process can be slow, particularly in cases involving maritime environments, digital records, and events occurring far from traditional surveillance systems. At the time of this recording, there has been no definitive court finding establishing exactly what happened to Lynette Hooker. Investigators continue reviewing evidence and reconstructing the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. And that brings this entire story back to the detail that reportedly changed the direction of the investigation: the batteries. Out of all the evidence investigators reportedly examined, weather records, witness statements, internet activity, equipment inventories, and digital timelines, it may ultimately be those battery-related records that prove most important. Because unlike people, electronic systems do not forget details over time. They simply record activity, quietly, continuously, without realizing that someday investigators might examine those records in an effort to understand what happened aboard a sailboat called Soulmate on a dark night in the Bahamas. Today, investigators continue searching for answers. Lynette Hooker's family continues living with uncertainty, and one of the most unusual missing person investigations in recent memory remains unresolved, which leaves one final question. What really happened to Lynette Hooker? And if you want continued updates on this case and other developing investigations, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Brian Crime TV so you never miss future coverage.